Welcome to Forum Chess Club. Today we are going to take a look at the French defense, which is very solid opening for black, but offers counter chances. Let's take a look. The French defense begins with the move pawn to e4, pawn to e6. Now, white's idea is that after this almost universal reply d4, setting up the ideal pawn center. Black would play pawn to d5 and set up a strong hold for himself in the center. Black goes ahead and he just accepts the modestly cramped game in exchange for some simpler strategic plans in the closed position. Black can comfortably play for his plans and avoid an early tactical battle, and he can also avoid a theoretical contest to see just who knows how much theory. This is the one reason why this opening is so popular with beginning and intermediate players. Let's get acquainted with some of the charm of black's strategy. To do that, we are going to focus on advanced variation, which begins with the move pawn to e5. This is a reasonable reply to the French defense by white. The only way white could have opened the game would have been to exchange the pawn on d5. But this has a reputation as being a very dry structure because of the pawns are asymmetrical, and things are very likely to be traded down the d files here. So normally white doesn't want to take on d5, so it's very reasonable for him to do at some point advance the pawn to e5. But today we are going to look at what happens if he does it straight away. Now that black has induced white into playing pawn to e5, black's ready for the second stage of his plan, which is to start laying pieces to the center. He wants to do that with breaks like pawn to c5 or else pawn to f6. He's also going to want to combine pawn to c5 with some piece pressure against the d4 pawn and see if he can crack down the light center. Now of course, white also has plan of his own. Since he has a space advantage, he can look, for example, to build up an attack on the king side with moves like f2 to f4 and then to f5. Or he can even sometimes find some play on the queen side. At the same time, he is going to focus on maintaining the center, and so it's a big battle of plans here. But one thing is that black's plan are a little bit easier to play, whereas white required more attention. So if white is a little bit less prepared, he can easily fall under an attack in the center or on the queen side. But black also needs to statistically accept a few downside in the French defense. Coming back, black has just used one of his pawn for passive defense on the third rank, and this translates into somewhat cramped position. For example, black's queen bishop looks very sicky compared to all other bishops on the board. This is a real problem piece for black in the French defense. What's more, the white e-pawn is ready to advance to e5 and at any moment, so black has to be a little careful to time natural developing moves like knight to f6. And he definitely tends to rule out bringing the bishop to the otherwise comfortable square on d6. Let's get back to the advanced variation. Black now begins with the counter variation, counter strategy with the move like pawn to c5, putting immediate pressure on the white's pawn chain. White has no real choice except to defend this pawn with the pawn which is pawn to c3. That way he can always recapture with the pawn and keep the center intact. Now black's play knight c6, and it's starting to build a little more pressure on white, and after knight to f3 we reach a standard starting position in the French advance. To help get acquainted with the major aims of the French defense, we are going to focus on just a single key variation today, which begins with the most aggressive move here, and that's queen to b6, further piling up pressure on the d4 pawn, while also eyeballing on the b2 pawn and making it difficult for the bishop to develop here. Now, the interesting thing here is that even though black's move queen b6 has put some pressure on the d4 pawn, black still has only 3 attackers, 1, 2 and 3, whereas white has 3 defenders, 1, 2, 3. So at the moment, this is not a real threat here to take on d4. How does black bring a 4th piece to attack the pawn? Well, he plans to bring this knight on g8 to f5 square, and he can do either by taking the knight to d7 and then to f5, or to h6 and then to f5. Normally he will combine this with a well-timed exchange on the d4 square by the pawn. For example, if white just plays the move bishop to e2, which is not a bad move by any means, black normally goes ahead and capture on d4, pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn. And now he start heading a knight to f5. For example, here he even has a sneaky way to set up a trap. He plays knight to h6, threatening to bring the knight to f5. And it looks like white can just play bishop to h6 And indeed, this has played many times. However, there is a little trap here, which is that instead of recapturing the bishop, black would play queen takes b2 with a threat to the rook. This gives black not only an extra pawn, but also quite a bit of initiative, since for example knight after knight b2 d2, black would take on h6, and in addition to being up ahead of pawn, he is still attacking this point on d4 twice. Backing up a bit, it's important to realize just how rapid black's attack is. For example, if after pawn takes pawn, knight to h6, if white simply castle here, black would already grab the upper hand with the knight to f5. As you see, you already have enough attackers on this pawn that we are actually threatening it. Because of the attack on the b2 pawn, white can't easily bring out the defender to this point. In fact, he already have a funny problem here. It's very difficult to defend this pawn, d4 pawn. So white has a couple of options in this position after knight to h6. Both of which are taking into account how quickly black's counterplay is coming. For example, he can play b2 to b3. But this makes himself vulnerable to a little check on b4 after knight f5, bishop b2, and now bishop b4 check. Since any interposition here would mess up the defense of d4. For example, if white plays knight b2 to d2, that's once cut off the queen from defense of d4. It's just waiting to be plugged off the board. Or if he would play knight to c3, he would be blocking the bishop from defense. So here we have it. So after this check, white's best move, it turns out to be king f1. I don't think this is a very healthy setup for white. Yes, he has a small space advantage, but giving up a castle right and now having any real plan here seems like a too high for a price to pay. So after knight h6, here he tends to recommend not b3, but a little bit more of tricky move, which is knight to c3. Again, this is a sort of thing that a lot of players are not going to know in these kind of positions. Now after we play knight f5, the idea is that white is going to make use of an in-between move, which is knight to a4. Now black has to waste some time addressing this attack to his queen. This leads to a short position, and there are many ways it can go. Let's just suppose the black plays this popular move, queen to a5 check, and now bishop d2, bishop b4, and our attack on d4 is still going strong right now. But now white simply plays bishop c3. This leads to an unusual position which should be about balanced according to the theory. Let's move back to the situation after black played queen to b6. All that analysis just showed is how rapidly white's d4 pawn can fall under attack if he is not careful. Bishop b2 isn't a bad move by any means, and in fact it even has a good score recently. But the traditional move in this position has been this quiet looking pawn move, a2 to a3. This a2 to a3 is a tricky little move that accomplishes more than one thing at a time. With this move, white is aiming to achieve b2 to b4, and this would not only gain some space for white, but also allow this bishop some freedom to move once again. Black may play this move under many circumstances. He might play it right away, or he might play it after black exchanges on b4, or he might even take on c5 first and then on b4. Now in this position, our previous plan for pawn takes pawn and then pawn takes pawn followed by knight to h6, it doesn't make quite as much sense here, since white now has a simple move, pawn to b4. After knight to f5, we would then have, let's say, bishop to b2. White's pawn are much more comfortably ranged on the queen side in this case, and it's difficult for black to gain counterplay. For example, if you play pawn to a5, then white would simply go ahead with b5. At the same time, white can always play g2 to g4 at some point in this position, which is a very common strategy in this position. This will also reduce the attackers on d4. This is not exactly how black wants to play in this position after white plays pawn to a3. Backing up a bit after pawn to a3. Fortunately for black, there's a pretty simple reply to all of this, which is simply pawn to c4. Due to the in-passant rule, if white were to play pawn b2 to b4, black could simply capture the pawn with c takes b3 using the in-passant rule. So c4 makes pawn to b4 very difficult to achieve. The second point which c4 has going for it is that it fixes a pretty big weakness on the b3 square, which might be useful, for example, for a knight if it could arrive there. However, it's little unclear to assess who has an upper hand on the queen side, or who benefited most from this move pawn to c4. The reason for that is that black did give up his pressure on the d4 point. This allows white to now get on with this development and start playing for his own attacking piece. Play tends to continue with the move knight b2 to d2. white hasn't entirely given up on the idea of trying to move this pawn. In this case, he probably wants to play it to b3, trying to break down the pawn chain. So to avoid this, black plays knight to a5, and finally white tends to get on his with his development of a king side here, either by bishop to e2 or with something like pawn to g2 and then bishop to g2. In the long term, what white wants to do is that he wants to build up an attack on the king side, either by eventually playing f pawn to f5 and then simply gradually moving the h pawn to h5. This is just one idea. This is actually the main ideas for white in this position. On the other hand, black has a very long ranging strategy of his own to play on the weakness squares on the queen side. For example, he might play bishop to d7 and then castle on the queen side. Maneuvers the knight over to some area on the queen side and just play for an initiative on this side of the board. This is a fascinating opening position to study, and it's very representative of the sort of strategic battle that the French defense can lead to. I did say that white might have a bit of initiative here. This is exactly the sort of closed strategic game that black is probably more comfortable with if he aimed for a French defense. That's what I wanted to show you for today. We have captured a lot of important strategies that are unique to the French defense, and we have gotten to foothold on this important opening. Perhaps you will choose to deepen your exploration of this opening on either side. That's all for today, and see you again with another opening. Thank you for watching.